Government-wide, agencies saw a loss of about 320,000 federal employees over the course of 2025. As he marked 1 year in office, President Trump called those cuts to the federal workforce, quote, tremendous, unquote. But good government groups are painting a much darker picture of what's to come. Here with more is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, great to have you.
Nice to be with you, Terry.
What exactly did President Trump and the White House say about the overalls to the federal workforce this past year?
Well, of course, they were touting a lot of their changes to the federal workforce as what they said were wins over the last year. The White House released a list last week of 365 ways, essentially, that the government has changed over the last year and Trump's first year in office. That includes several changes that we, of course, know about from the federal workforce, things like the merit-based federal hiring plan, removing diversity, equity, and inclusion from different government programs and services, overhauling the probationary period and how that works for federal employees, requiring everyone to return to the office full time. And then, of course, top of mind for a lot of employees and those who are interested is just the cuts, the simple cuts and decrease in size to the federal workforce. During a White House press conference last week, Trump touted those cuts, as you said, as tremendous.
But we've slashed tremendous numbers of people off the federal payroll. I mean, we have jobs where they had 10 people for every job. We're proud of the fact that we cut so many because, again, I don't want to cut people. But when you cut them and they go out and get a better job, I like to cut them. And sometimes they have to be forced to do that.
But good government groups are painting a different picture here. What have these stakeholders said about the changes to the workforce throughout 2025?
Well, Terry, you won't be really surprised to hear that a lot of these groups are very much in opposition to what President Trump and the White House have been saying about these cuts to the workforce. They say that the large-scale layoffs, cuts to government programs, were a really negative impact on how the government works and is able to serve the public. A lot of this information comes from the Partnership for Public Service, which is a nonpartisan organization that advocates for government reforms and improvements. Max Stier, who's the partnership's president and CEO, he described 2025 as, for the federal workforce and the government at large, a year unlike any other.
It was a challenging year for our government. Indeed, I would say the most significant reduction in federal government capacity over the course of a year that we've ever experienced in our history. And that reduction in capacity is best represented in our most important asset, our federal workforce.
The partnership also released a report last week with more details on the impacts of the federal workforce changes. What was in that report?
That's right. This report goes into a lot of detail about everything that we saw in terms of changes to the federal government, going in part agency specific and talking about cuts to agencies like the IRS, Social Security Administration, Department of Health and Human Services, and FEMA, and many other agencies, and just going into detail on how each of those agencies has been impacted by the staffing cuts, saying that, there's delays in basic services. There's increased wait times, for instance, at SSA. It's harder to deliver disaster assistance during emergencies due to cuts at places like FEMA and other agencies. A lot of that detail is in the partnership's report. But then it also talks about the impacts to federal employees themselves, how these things have changed morale, changed employee engagement, and how employees are doing day to day, really. So there's also been a lot of data from the Office of Personnel Management as well on some of these changes to the federal workforce. So we're seeing more transparency emerge, more stories emerge on how things have changed. Stier from the partnership did give kudos to OPM for this new workforce data that they released, but he also had a more negative view of what that data actually depicted.
There's a lot of very rich material that, again, it tells a disturbing story about, who we've lost in our government. And what is actually happening to the workforce, but it doesn't tell you anything about what is truly most fundamental, which is their morale and what they think about what's happening right now.
As folks look ahead, Drew, are they optimistic that 2026 will bring more stability, or is there a downside to all of this?
What I think we're likely going to see throughout 2026 is, now that we have seen this big reduction in headcount, we've seen a lot of the initial and very fast-paced changes that the Trump administration made. We're going to start seeing a lot more of the deeper policy shifts come out over the next year. OPM Director Scott Cooper has talked extensively about changes to performance management for employees, changes to how employees are, or how job candidates are vetted, and making sure that they're hired based on their qualifications. And there's also one notable change that a lot of people have discussed that is still ahead, is the change called schedule policy / career and that employment classification. Of course, as we know, that's a resurgence of the formerly known Schedule F. And that's something I think that we'll see coming forward that's going to have, some level of deeper impact or deeper change to the federal workforce. And Max Dyer, again, talked a little bit about what is ahead for federal employees here.
As challenging as 2025 was, I think we can expect even harder days ahead in 2026. The change of our federal government into one that is a loyalist workforce as opposed to a professional one is a process that we anticipate moving forward in 2026.
So the changes are going to keep coming, it sounds like.
That's right. We're going to be looking out for those regulations, further changes, as I said, to performance management, many other things that are still ahead in the coming months, and we'll be tracking all of it.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, it's good to have you on the case.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com.